to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. And this is your host, broadcasting from Washington, D.C. It's July 1st, 2016. It's a day heavy in historical associations, excuse me, and anniversaries. It's July 1st. And of course, today we have the presence of a British nuclear submarine. The withered mummy of British imperialism is still attempting to lash out. A nuclear-powered submarine is now anchored below Gibraltar, the Rock. And of course, the Rock, it is no rock under modern conditions. Even 100 years ago, it was indefensible. The only thing that has kept Spain out of Gibraltar is a combination of, well, let's not be too harsh, but certainly of British dupery, going back to marriage policies of the British royal family back in the time of Edward VII. This is all discussed in Émile Flourens and his famous book, La France Conquise, France Conquered by Edward VII, 1907. He writes quite a bit about that. So look at that. A nuclear submarine, the first fruits of Brexit, the kinds of tensions among the large European states, these central to Western European states, that had thought to have been banished after 1945, and now they're back because of the crackpot meddling of the British elite. And when we call them the British elite from now on, we've got to somehow call them the counting house of China, right? Used to be the workshop of the world. Now it's the counting house of China. We are in the presence of a cunning, treacherous, hostile, dastardly Anglo-Chinese alliance. Sino-British, Anglo-Chinese. I think the British will soon be gone, so maybe Anglo-Chinese or Sino-English, something like that. This is not humanitarian. This is not the wonders of the Spice Road or the Silk Road or anything like this. Those are more like the Spanish Road, if you know something about European strategy in the late 1500s and 1600s. The way that the Spanish Empire controlled the continent of Europe was by having this road which went everywhere, right? It's a system of roads. And that meant that the Spanish could deliver their troops where they wanted them. And when you talk about the Silk Road and the Spice Road today, these have now become, in effect, the tentacles of an imperialist power. And I join, once again, with the Italian economist Sapedli in pointing out to mushheads the world over, you who complain about U.S. world domination will be singing a different tune if you ever see Chinese world domination. You will like that a whole lot less. So all of the dumb, duped, gulled readers of Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky, all telling how benevolent a power China is. I'm afraid it's not. It could be, of course, but not under the morally challenged Chinese Communist Party, a very, very special bunch of people. And of course, their anti-Americanism and their Oriental treachery, this is simply beyond challenge. So that's why we have this British nuclear submarine anchored there at Gibraltar, and parachute troops, paratroopers, special kinds of, essentially, SAS, I'm sure, will be there. Special Air Services, right? And the various equivalents thereof will be there. So let's take a look at the other side of this coin, right? It is the 100th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme, the first big day of actual attack by the British and French infantries that had been preceded by 8 days of bombardment. And the goal was to conquer high points like Thiepval in the countryside, and then use that as a jumping off point for a march on Berlin. And of course, that never happened. And instead, you had a butcher's bill of hundreds of thousands of troops on the two sides. And by the way, it is this combination of Somme and Verdun in the same years essentially mean that Europe's world supremacy had ended, because it meant that these countries were then so weakened and so indebted as a result of their folly, their incalculable folly of 1916, we're talking 1916 now, Verdun and Somme, that by 1917 it was clear that nobody in Europe could end the war, and therefore the U.S. ended the war in service of the British and the French, and that was not a good thing. So we should remember all that stuff. Remember above all that the causes of the First World War are primarily to be sought in the diplomacy of Edward VII. Perfide Albion. Well, maybe we'll have a special chapter on Perfide Albion, because that is what we are seeing monstrously today. We've also got some really big anniversaries here in the U.S. Today is the anniversary of the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, when gallant commanders like John Buford of the cavalry of the Army of the Potomac stopped the Confederates outside of Gettysburg to the northwest and held there for some hours. A fight that then stretched all the way over to the Barlow Knoll. The 11th Corps of Howard was in there, and others. And John Reynolds of the 1st Corps, commanding on the battlefield, was killed as he was attempting to scout the best place to put the Union forces. And by suggesting Cemetery Hill, he, I think, proposed correctly, even though he paid with his life. And out on the Mississippi, July 1st, well, the cordons, the coils of the siege of Vicksburg by Ulysses Grant and his right-hand man, William Tecumseh Sherman. They are out there strengthening the siege, so that by July 4th, 1863, one of the greatest days in U.S. history, you've got Lee retreating, defeated, decimated from Gettysburg, and the surrender then from the Confederate Army, commanded by Pemberton in Vicksburg. That comes in on the wires. So that's a three-way celebration. July 4th, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, one of the great days. Think about that on especially on the 3rd and the 4th of this year. But you've got all these interesting anniversaries. We'll devote as much time to this as we can. But let's look now at the question of Trump. Now, Trump gave a speech on tariffs, trade, and to some extent on economics. This was done on Tuesday of this week. And of course, this was a very serious occasion, because they had Trump housebroken. They had Trump reading off a teleprompter. The fascist billionaire demagogue was reduced to reading words off the printed page, in effect. Now, some people have been, I think, duped. Certainly a lot of people have been gulled and duped by this performance. The first thing you want to note is that this was a con job for a specific target, a mark. And we'll tell you who that was in just a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. The afternoon now of July 1st. That's Gettysburg, that's Vicksburg, that's the Somme. And on the Somme, the poor British and Commonwealth forces were commanded by officers that were totally incompetent. This is above all Field Marshal Haig. When you look at somebody like Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage, we can do all the rhyming stuff. You know who I mean. These essentially airheaded demagogues. By the end of this week, Johnson had to admit that he had absolutely no plan. He didn't know what to do. He had no idea. There was no program. It was a lark. It was a fraternity prank, right? It was the blonde beast. There's the blonde beast, Boris Johnson. And he's been, a certain amount of backlash on that, right? What kind of dilettantes? What kind of nonchalant, blasé kind of approach to the lives and the well-being of people is this? And the same thing from this obviously frequent imbibing Nigel Farage, who's a stockbroker from the City of London with nicotine stains all over his fingers. Bad scene. But we've got our equivalent, right? The guy who would wake up and say, "Oh my God, I'm president. What do I do now?" That's Trump. And there is that movie from Robert Redford, I think in the 1970s, where he gets himself elected, and then he looks in the mirror and is terrified and wonders, "What do I do now?" Let's look at Trump's economic speech. On the teleprompter, to remain coherent, don't worry, he's gone off now in the interim since then. He's not going to stay on the teleprompter. His psychopathology makes it impossible. But in terms of what he said, he obviously had all kinds of ghostwriters. We're not being told which ghostwriters he had. There's an official version that comes from his campaign office, which has got nothing but footnotes, right? It's got footnotes all over the place. Now, this was, for Trump, a rather sharp left turn. It was a turn towards reality, and it was a left turn. Therefore, I guarantee you, he didn't write it, and it won't last. You can be sure of that. It's already dissipating. But here was the idea. It was a very crude, very transparent attempt to try to get the Bernie Sanders supporters, right, to dupe the disappointed Bernie backers and to get them on board with Trump. But, of course, it's done in a very stupid, ham-handed, and inept, bungling way. For example, if you look at Bernie Sanders, right, what's the main target in every speech by Bernie Sanders? Wall Street, of course. Wall Street. Now, whether he's got, the right message or no message or whatever it is, Bernie is always going to talk to you about Wall Street. And this is valid. That's an important public service from Bernie. In the case of Trump, he's trying to give this speech to dupe the Bernie guys. And what does he come up with? He mentions Wall Street twice, 2 times. That's it. Wall Street gets in there twice. And how does he mention Wall Street as the public enemy of the U.S.? No, he mentions it as the people who are supporting Hillary Clinton's Wall Street funders. She will do just as she has betrayed American workers for Wall Street throughout her career. All right, fine. But how about you, Don? What have you done throughout your career, right? The obvious thing, the hypocrisy factor here is overwhelming because Trump is a dyed-in-the-wool, fanatical, union buster, wage gouger. I mean, he takes this even into the criminal sphere. He doesn't maintain contracts. He doesn't send the check. He wants to gouge people, loot them, rip them off any way he can, and then throw them on the human junk heap. So I think that's an important part. He should have attacked Wall Street more. He's a dummy, okay? But you can see also that the speechwriters, the academics who did this or something like that, they're also aware that there's that money group, right? The Sheldon Adelson group, all those corporations that would like to come to the Republican convention, but they won't because Trump is too scurrilous, too radical, too obscene, too racist for them. And therefore, everything that Trump puts out, as long as he's acting housebroken, has to be screened. So now look, the big deal here, the overarching theme, is protectionism. Trump wants you to know that he is a protectionist, that protectionism goes back to Washington and Hamilton, and that it was very successful, and more recently it has been abandoned, and that this is the root cause, in his view, of just about everything, which is obviously overdone, and we'll tell you why. Trump has got to blame everything on trade, and he's got to blame everything on laws that have gone through Congress, and therefore on politicians, senators, congressmen, presidents, trade reps, so forth. Trump has to blame them, because if he accepts a broader view of globalization, as I would demand, he's going to start having to attack his Wall Street masters. And don't buy this bunk that Trump is a Wall Street outsider. The guy's just a typical old multi-billionaire living in Manhattan, speculating like mad, getting a sweetheart, crony, backdoor bailout from the Federal Reserve in 1990 to 1991, at a time when Citibank, his main banker, had been seized by the Fed. Good old Don benefited so he could keep a lot of his property that otherwise would have been stripped away. So he is a Wall Street insider. His definition of globalization is absurdly narrow, because again, he's got to keep everything focused on the politicians, like a good fascist, right? Because this is one of the hallmarks of fascism, that the fascist attacks the bourgeois politician, the parliamentarian, the parliamentary cretin, whatever you want, but not the banker. Generally speaking, not the banker when you're dealing with European fascism. So Don is going to sell us something that applies to a very small part of globalization. And we're going to find out that he's not even very radical. Back in a minute. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. It's the afternoon of July 1st, and we've got to think about the big historical issues posed by July 1st, by July 4th. This is our July 4th weekend edition. So, Trump, you're going to see this. He has a tremendously reductionist approach to trade. Let me just knock off a couple of things, though. Trump, in the course of this speech, says, never, never, never nation building, focus everything on ourselves, right? We know that he believes in economics as a zero-sum game. Look up zero-sum game in economics on the internet or on tarpley.net. You will find a distinguished essay by yours truly talking about how the crackpot, proto-Malthusian, Venetian economist Gian Maria Ortes around 1780 posited this idea of a zero-sum game. In other words, there's no absolute profit that can be increased. If I prosper, it means somebody else is starving, and if I'm starving, somebody else is prospering. And this is what the American system, especially American system post-1945, has shown is not true, that you can have a broad prosperity around the world, tide that raises all boats, and many people benefit from it. But now also I wanted to just point out, if you want to look at the causes of U.S. prosperity, say from 1945, we might even go up to 1975, but certainly to 1970. From 1945 to 1970, a quarter century already, you would have to say one of the main things was the Marshall Plan, the European Recovery Program of 1947, 1948, that the U.S. using not astronomical amounts of money, but $4 or $5 billion at the most, we can check the sums, but not a lot, was able to restart credit, banking, economic activity in Europe. And that from this we had the benefits of export trade. In other words, whatever was manufactured in Europe could be bought up by the U.S. at currency rates that made it very attractive. And also that these countries were convinced not to pitch themselves into the abyss of despair. The abyss of despair is today Brexit or Trump. In those days, the abyss of despair was, let's go over to Stalin and see what it's like to be looted in a slightly different way. Okay? Now, we have various anti-American outpourings around the world. I would just remind people Brexit is not likely to end the influence and standing of the United States in the world. I don't think so. I think this is going to be the British cutting off their nose to spite their faces. They have leapt into the abyss of vandalism, adventurism, and incalculable folly. The four freedoms from the Atlantic Charter, and I guess we're having one of those anniversaries too in August. Remember, freedom of speech, Trump is against it. Freedom of religion, Trump is against that too. Freedom from fear, Trump is against that too. You're going to be deported. And freedom from want, Trump wants austerity. He talks out of all sides of his mouth. But the four freedoms need to be back in style. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, freedom from want. That's the Atlantic Charter, and we know Trump hates all of that. So let's look a little bit more in a detailed way about what he has to say. The big thing with Trump is he says he's a protectionist, but he does not have a protective tariff. For my money, the argument could end right here. Oh, he wants to be protectionist. Oh, he's so upset about exporting all those plants and so forth. He's done it himself. God knows. All of his stupid products, his suits, his steaks, his wine, his mineral water, whatever he's got. Everything Trump does is outsourced, right? He wants coolie wages. He doesn't. It's nothing like Buy American stickers around Trump Organization headquarters. So he's a complete fraud. And you can see his mentality. He says he cares about workers. How can he care about workers when you can see the life that he has lived, which is one implacable assault on workers, their rights, their human dignity, their standards of living, their benefits, their social safety net, their health plans, and all the rest of this stuff. The guy is he's a monster. He's a caricature of a 19th century Dickensian Scrooge as a boss. So it's a wonderful protectionist speech. I've heard people say, "Oh, it's protectionism now, isn't it?" Well, the main thing in protectionism is to have a tariff. In other words, you've got to have an import duty, a tax, which you levy on commodities coming into the country. And Trump doesn't have it. And of course, it's a matter of law. It's got to be permanent. It doesn't come and go from day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year, because of the need for planning and so forth, right? If you're going to invest in the U.S., you've got to know that you've got a degree of protection. Now, what I'm proposing is a relatively moderate protective tariff. I'm saying 15% across the board. That is, unless there's some urgent crisis. Suppose there's a vaccine you need for Zika or Ebola or whatever it is, and you want to bring that in. You could waive the tariff on an emergency basis. Yes, waiving the tariff can be done on the emergency basis. But with Trump, the tariff is the emergency basis. He believes in punitive tariffs. Sometimes you need them. But the main thing you need is an orderly, structural piece of regulation so that you've got a regulated economy and you can fight off dumping because you're going to know about it. You're always going to have a 15% tax, and you can do something about it more than that. So this is a pretty extreme form of demagogy. For example, the other thing with Trump, right, is, he's a nationalist, right? Or those guys with Brexit, they're nationalists. Well, with Trump, what kind of a nationalist attacks 20, 30, 35% of his own country? What kind of a nationalist starts off with a frontal attack on significant minorities inside your own country that you want to not antagonize, but you want to integrate them and make them enthusiastic for the overall national project? And that project is not to enrich the scoundrel, predatory bloodsucker like Donald Trump. Or, for example, in the case of the Brexit, right? What great nationalists, right? Nigel Farage and this blonde beast, right? The Boris Johnson. They're nationalists? Well, they seem to be destroying their own country. How do you destroy your own country if you're a nationalist? It's insane. You're going to be left with Little England, a little piece of Wales, whatever that's worth, Scotland gone, and Northern Ireland back with Ireland after all these centuries. So what nationalist destroys his own country? Makes no sense. He's a racist, fascist, nativist, sectionalist, and we'll be back in a minute. To World Crisis Radio. This is your host, Webster Tarpley, here in Washington, D.C. So Trump is not a nationalist. He's a secessionist, I guess. He's a copperhead. How about that? He's a sectionalist. He's a nativist. He is a racist, to be sure. Above all, I think fascist pretty much does it, because fascism has often led to civil war. Key example, Italy. Not too long after fascism came in, the Italians were fighting on both sides in World War II, and that included within the country a civil war. So that's Trump, a phony nationalist and a phony protectionist. Let me just get right to the heart of the matter. At the end of his demagogic ranting speech, he has 7 points that he promises he's going to carry out. And probably the toughest of these is point 7. Trump's point 7 is, if China does not stop its illegal activities, including its theft of American trade secrets, I will use every lawful precedent. He ad-libs. Hey, look, this is very easy. This is so easy. I love saying this. I will use every lawful presidential power to remedy trade disputes, including the application of tariffs consistent with Section 201 and 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 and Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. Now, you're supposed to be impressed. You're supposed to think that Donald went to the New York Public Library and found this stuff. Well, don't be duped. This is a lot of show, okay? This is all hat and no cattle. Because what we found just in the last couple of months, in dealing with China, Obama applied a tariff, this a punitive temporary tariff, of 266%. 266% was the first wave of a punitive tariff applied by Obama to Chinese producers of rolled cold steel as they tried to dump their products, right? This stuff is used for automobiles, appliances, and things like this. And then, just in the past, 2 months, Obama has applied an emergency punitive tariff of 522% on dumped cold-rolled steel, or it means essentially Chinese cold-rolled steel coming into the U.S. So 266 to 522. Now, Obama in the speech, Obama is tougher than Trump. That was the point on that, at least on this, in this area. Trump is trying to tell us how much he loves Reagan. Oh, boy, does he love Reagan. Reagan did something like 45% on motorcycles and 100% on some other commodities. And it's all fine, but you see, Obama has done even more. And if you go to the trade representative's office of the Obama administration, right, the current regime, then you're going to find that, they've actually been more energetic. They've been more energetic than Obama. I'm sorry, that Obama's been more energetic than Trump in doing these things. So we just look at this stuff. Since 2009, the U.S. has won significant cases in aircraft, $18 billion worth, European Union subsidies. SUVs, autos, illegal Chinese taxes, steel, illegal Chinese dumping, India, ban on U.S. poultry. So it goes both ways. So you can see that this great show, right, is only for dupes, right? You got to be dumb to believe Trump. He's a con artist. He's trying to dupe you. If you look at these other things, right, he's always telling you, I'm going to, number one is I'm going to get out of the TPP. Well, that's great. Nobody's in the TPP, so that's nothing. I'm going to appoint the toughest and smartest trade negotiators to fight on behalf of the American workers. Who's that going to be? Carl Icahn? That guy's the enemy of the American worker and has been since he was born. How about Mnuchin of Goldman Sachs and Soros? How about Manafort, right, from the torturers lobby? What do you think the labor policies were of those policies like Zaire, right, that Manafort was protecting? He's going to tell the Secretary of Commerce to find everything wrong and come up with proposals. Again, this is absolutely nothing. Then he says, I'm going to tell our NAFTA partners that I want to renegotiate the terms by a lot. I want to get a better deal by a lot, not just a little, but by a lot for our workers. Well, what does it mean? What does that mean, a lot? Are we talking wages? Are we talking hours? Are we talking safeguards? Are we talking workman's compensation? What are we talking about? Wages, hours? And this is coming from somebody whose whole life telegraphs into the world, I hate workers. He's an anti-working class exploiter, right? He's a looter. How about number 5, currency manipulation? Oh, China drives down their currency through currency manipulation. Yes, indeed. It's called competitive devaluation. But who else has been doing competitive devaluation? Who invented it? Who invented it? The British. It was Ramsay MacDonald, the Labour Party, and then what can we say, all-party traitor Prime Minister of Britain. This guy was in the Labour Party, and then he quit to join a reactionary government. Ramsay MacDonald was the first guy who showed that by radically devaluing the pound, you could improve your status at the expense of others in a depression, okay? And what have they just done with Brexit, knowing that if this went through, right, if Brexit won, there would be a steep dive in the value of the pound, and that was down 10% in one couple of hour period during the panic. Now it's a little bit less depressed, but the pound is in bad shape. But the Brexiteers go on TV and they say, yes, this is how we're going to undercut everybody. We're going to dump our commodities all over the place. So we can just go on with it. Now, here's the lies, I think, of Trump. And remember, in this entire exercise, he does not have a permanent, across-the-board protective tariff, modest though it may be, and modest I think it should be. We also have to add, from our point of view, Tax Wall Street Party, that if you have certain areas, some areas may need more protection. Tariffs involve a schedule, right? A schedule means the different items, products, services, and finances, too, that come in, and what is the tariff duty on each one of them. So that's the fraud of Trump. This is a completely demagogic, hollow, lying speech. And if you were fooled, in other words, if you actually read through it and you were fooled, you should search your conscience and you should commit yourself to becoming a more knowledgeable and more sophisticated observer and actor and activist. Buttons. Okay, back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. It's the afternoon of July 1st, 2016. We're going into the 4th of July weekend. Beware of terrorism. Beware of terrorism, because terrorism serves Trump. If there's any terror activity, the beneficiary is Trump. That will then become part of a strategy of tension scenario. The term comes from NATO intelligence, Italy, fall of 1969. And the culmination of that, the October surprise. Something big, something like Benghazi. That was what Benghazi was supposed to be. And somehow it didn't happen. Notice, people who have read the 800 pages do point out that nobody can explain why, if Leon Panetta gave 2 orders to the Pentagon to send in military assets, 2 orders to send in 3 military assets, nothing was done for an hour and a half. I'll tell you why. Petraeus, grill Petraeus, grill the CIA boss of that day, who was at the movies, and then grill Petraeus also on his cronies in the Pentagon that he can tell, to slow down or speed up or whatever it was. And the other guy you got to grill, Carter Ham, U.S. AFRICOM, with those planes sitting not in the top of the Adriatic, but on Sicily. Sigonella, Sicily, had military assets that could have made a big difference. So this Trey Gowdy, we call him Slickums. He looks like Alfalfa in the old Our Gang, Little Rascals comedies. That guy, he needs to be grilled, not to grill. But now look, Trump obviously doesn't want to talk about Wall Street. He wants to talk about dirty politicians and sellouts of that sort, but not Wall Street, not his friend Carl Icahn. Oh, the other thing, he wants to blame Clinton for NAFTA, and there's plenty of blame. But remember, NAFTA was negotiated and signed by Bush the Elder, George H.W. Bush, and Clinton then got it passed, that's for sure. But then one of the biggest allies that Clinton had when he got it passed was none other than Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich, by that time aspiring Speaker of the House himself, that was the guy who got it through. And that's the guy that seems to be, as of today, the top of the list on Trump's vice presidential list. I think we have the raving Michael Savage, right? One of the several versions of a crazed petty bourgeois id that are running around in U.S. broadcasting. I think Michael Savage has pledged that if Trump gives the nod, the Veep nod to Newt, then that's going to be the end of it for Savage and Trump. But they never do it. The dog always returns to his vomit because they have to. But now look, let's get an idea, right? Globalization is really the enemy. He tries to make this point, right? Trump, on the one hand, tries to make it look like he's trying to attack a larger notion of globalization, but of course, then he never does. Now, I wrote my I think significant book, first edition, 1999, and it's called "Surviving the Cataclysm." And it includes a critique of globalism, which I often call globaloney, because I want people to scorn it. So towards the end of that book, I offer the following list. What are the ingredients of globaloney? In other words, if you want to get out of a depression and you want to return to prosperity, what do you have to do? And what you have to do is, first of all, address the question of floating rate currencies, all right? In other words, if you don't like currency manipulation, then you're going to have some kind of a system of fixed rates. And that is a complicated question these days, but certainly somehow among euro, dollar, yen, renminbi, and possible regional Russian or Arab currencies, you got to do something about the wild gyrations, right? At the beginning of last year, we saw tremendous upvaluation of the Swiss franc and so forth, and you got to deal with that. Secondly, I think in many ways the most destructive part of globalization is hot money speculation, stock jobbing, usury, hedge funds, and a multi-trillion-dollar worldwide bucket shop of financial derivatives. You've got to tax that. Other parts you've got to ban, right? Collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps, and all the rest of it. 3, privately owned and privately controlled central banks with the private bank for international settlements as the flagship, but including the private Federal Reserve, the private Bank of England, the private Bank of France, the private Bundesbank, and so forth. And private is, whatever the technicalities of ownership, that the policies they carry out are not national policies, but serve only the interest of a very narrow class of financier oligarchs and parasites. 4, free trade, dumping, the runaway shop, NAFTA, WTO, European single market, and so forth, right? That's a key part. That's obviously an essential part of globalization. The other problems you face, 5, secular deflation. It's been going on, right? If we had a little bit of inflation, people's debts would be lightening up. No. And the policy for most of these years has been depression as a cure for inflation. Inflation is the worst because it undermines, they say, the value of the rich people's money. So therefore, we got to have depression. So the whole thing is visited on the poor and the more disadvantaged. So we got to get out of this Keynes in reverse. We have been suffering through deregulation. Donald, why didn't you talk to us? Deregulation, especially deregulation of financial markets, growing domination by oligopolies and cartels. This is an unsung part of it, but it's very powerful. Seventh, stagnating and declining world production, above all when you measure it in per capita terms, right? You could say U.S. production has gone up, yeah, but what about if you divide it among the number of people in the country? 8, the casino society, frantically seeking monetary wealth under the constant shadow of systemic crisis. And we're back in that this week. Permanently, number 9, permanently high unemployment, declining standards of living, weak labor unions, union busting, a shrinking middle class, fabulous wealth for a tiny parasitical oligarchy of financiers, and it's about 500,000 people in the world that are really the first magnitude beneficiaries. Then we have the cancer of anti-statism, with the withering away of the national state, the withering away of national infrastructure, social safety net. The only time the institutions mobilize is when the insolvency of financial institutions threatens a systemic crisis. And we've had all kinds of examples. The TARP, the most recent, IMF bailouts funded by taxpayers, and so forth. Number 11, a race to the bottom among nations, even among states, provinces, to gut the environmental standards, safety regulations. We'll be back in a minute to finish up the last couple of points. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. And this is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. So look at these features of globalization, right? Essentially, Trump he manages to talk about one of them, which is the free trade dumping runaway shop he's not so interested in. Never says anything about the Federal Reserve. Very, very interesting. So there is a race to the bottom among the nations, while these, the health, environmental safety, and other regulations are gutted, and tax incentives, of course, go to parasitical, speculative capitalists, and maybe sometimes to rip-off venture capitalists. Number 12, the point is oligarchy. And oligarchy is referred to under such terms as the establishment, the elites, the market, market forces, market democracy. All that means oligarchy. It is sinister. It is where the rich rule and others have precious little to say about what is going on. So Trump is not developing a sufficient critique. He's not going to attack the ones that are especially involved with Wall Street, like the hot money, like the casino economy, and so forth. So you let Trump take power, you will have economic immiseration beyond what you have now. So he's using a very narrow idea of globalization, i.e. merchandise trade. That's it, because if he goes beyond that, he's going to have to attack Wall Street, and that he cannot do. It's got to be only politicians that he takes aim at. Then there's the question of exports. The thing with Trump is, you notice he never talks about exports, or seldom. In other words, he has in his speech that there's an $800 billion a year U.S. merchandise trade deficit. Well, one way you can address that is to try to produce some of these things in the U.S., although I'll show you that's a very limited thing. Has not been successful when tried, and it has been tried. That's really not very reliable. But the other thing then is you start a campaign for high technology exports. And this gives you a much better view of a modern economy and what it means. Because now you're going to say, well, what are you going to export? Well, obviously there are, traditional favorites, right? Grain, soybeans, all of this stuff, right? Absolutely. Those are all great things. But then you got to get high technology exports, high capital intensity, high energy density, high value. What would it mean? Nuclear reactors. Westinghouse can get a 4th generation pebble bed high temperature nuclear reactor and sell that to the world. Think of things that people want. Everybody's going nuclear. Everybody but here. By the way, the Chinese are buying they're going to build the nuclear reactors for the British. How about that? The Chinese. So, in the case of the United States, we should be exporting high technology nuclear reactors. Beyond that, we should be the first to put a functioning thermonuclear fusion reactor on the market. Our space program should be revived so that we can derive products and research and scientific insights from that. In other words, make the spin-offs of the space program into lucrative export commodities. You obviously have the entire wave of pharmaceuticals. You have the entire area of cybernetics, of computers, and the rest of that. And that gives you some idea. Now, if you want to have a workforce at that level, we're not going to simply import people with a brain drain from other countries, right? You're going to have to start reinvesting in the American workforce, and that means education. Isn't it clear that in this kind of a world, everybody will have to have a college degree? Get a college degree come hell or high water. And don't listen to those fake neocons like William Bennett, who tells you all this stuff about college degree. And the first thing you want to ask him is, where are your kids? Oh, at Harvard or whatever it is, right? So they are fakers. Don't be duped. Don't be fooled. So once you look about high technology exports, you also have this problem, and this is the problem for everybody. You've got to be tops in the world in some field. You've got to be the world leader in something. A couple of years ago in Iceland, it was clear that Iceland could be the world leader in geothermal energy out of the ground, okay? A little bit more recently now in Donetsk, it was clear that Donetsk could be the world leader in technology for coal mines. There are people coming from all around the world to Donetsk, even with the machine guns chattering in the background, because they wanted to get that world-leading technology for coal mines. Get the idea? Everybody's got to find something like that. Now, the United States could find multiple areas of world leadership, and obviously you'd have to. So that's the way to look at it, right? And that's not what you're hearing from Trump, because then he'd have to talk about investing in a labor force. And this is also the area where you see that your Latino and Asian and other labor force is exactly what you need. You've got to upgrade those people. You've got to invest in them. You've got to be glad to have them, because otherwise what you'd have is what Japan and so many others have, right? Again, Japan, Russia, China, Europe, what do they have? They have a demographic crisis. They don't have enough people. This is a problem the U.S. does not have. The biggest strategic advantage for the U.S. is the proclivity of people to come here. Now, just in terms of technical economics, because I found this really interesting, what we've got with Trump is essentially an approach to industrialization, or he would call it reindustrialization, I guess. But this has been tried before. The actual strategy that Trump is peddling has been tried. It was known as import substitution. It was sometimes called import substitution industrialization. So the idea was, you are, let's say, Argentine economist in the 50s and 60s. How do you try to get economic development? And we'll see that Trump is coming up with the wrong answer. Not only wrong, but already demonstrably the failed answer. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So, the old school of import substitution industrialization, ISI. This is vieux jeu these days. But the top honcho was Raoul Prebisch, Prebisch. And his school was import substitution. So you're sitting in Buenos Aires and you say, hey, we have limited dollars, limited hard currency. Why are we spending so much on umbrellas? And then the answer became, well, that's because that's what people want. And therefore, the word would come down, let's build an umbrella factory and manufacture for our own internal market. We can use a protective tariff to prevent other umbrella makers from interfering, from dumping, from any of that. We'll protect our infant umbrella industry, and let's try that. Now, it sounds plausible, but it does not work. It doesn't work, and it also ends you up in debt. Why would these countries, such as Argentina, already by the 70s, they had billions and billions of dollars in international financial debt. And Prebisch was an influential guy. He had a certain reputation. He was really the founder of UNCTAD, right? In the United Nations bureaucracy, that was a fairly left-wing bureaucracy. But import substitution turned out to be unsustainable over time, and it produced high economic and social costs. It could only work even temporarily in the larger countries, but it just you couldn't learn how to manufacture all these different things at the same time. So the outcome of import substitution was to increase economic equality. The poverty rate rose above 30%. And so therefore there was not enough internal demand for what you were trying to do. So import substitution became discredited, and a lot of people would say that the build-up to the Latin American debt crisis of the early 1980s, which you can read about in my Surviving the Cataclysm, that was really the result of too much import substitution. Now, what's the other approach, which is the successful one, the one that has worked, that's been tremendously successful? Of course, in the background, it's Alexander Hamilton, it's Henry Clay, it's a tariff, it's infrastructure, a national bank, and a protective tariff. That's what works. But in more recent times, that has been codified into MITI, right? The Japanese Ministry of International Trade. The Ministry of Industry and International Trade, MITI. And that was essentially the Japanese miracle. That's the Japanese method, and that works much better than any Marxist command economy or what have you. That, in turn, is the basis of the Taiwan experience on the Republic of China on Taiwan, right? Tremendous economic miracle. Similarly, in the countries called the Tigers, right? Taiwan is a tiger. South Korea, the ROK, that's a tiger. Then you've got Singapore as a tiger. Hong Kong is a tiger. So what do? They don't worry about imports practically at all. They say, we have to have high technology exports. We got to sell on the world market. We got to produce high quality, high energy intensive stuff that people want to buy. And with that, we'll have the foreign exchange to solve all of our other problems. And that would be the way to do it with the U.S. What are we going to do? Go back to import substitution? You get the idea. Trump wants to bring home all of these rickety, shabby plants. Where have they been? They've been in the U.S. Then they've been in Maquiladora in Mexico in the 90s. Then they've been in Beijing or Thailand or Vietnam. This is crazy. You've got to use the law of combined and uneven development to leapfrog over everybody and end up with the best energy production, the most modern, the space program, and go right to the most modern rail and other transportation infrastructure and so on down the line. You get the idea? So what Trump is selling you is the failed program of Raoul Prebisch of the Import Substitution School, a kind of, well, the difference is I think Prebisch was probably well-meaning, but Trump certainly is not. So that's it. Trump is going back to a discredited school when obviously anybody here could choose the American system, which is the most successful. So I think that rounds out the despicable perfidy and idiocy of Trump's speech. And notice, he says he doesn't like currency manipulation. Well, his British friends, Rupert Murdoch and Boris Johnson and the rest of them, they love currency manipulation. Currency manipulation is their way of life. So that's awful. Now, what are we going to get out of this with the British? We try to read you some little snippets here, I guess. We've got a number of memos now that we've found, which essentially go into what kinds of antics. Well, Chatham House here. This is great. Chatham House. Chatham House is the Royal Institute for International Affairs, founded around the time of Versailles. There was an attempt to put one in New York with the same name, but that was too much flunkies for Perfide Albion. But they have it. Chatham House. And is the big explosion, of course, was last October when President Xi undertook that visit to London. So the comment at that point from Chatham House, right? This is like Council on Foreign Relations, Bilderberg Group. Britain is betting on the power of the renminbi. And you heard that from a couple of people today. It was mentioned in the NPR. They had the editor of the Financial Times, Lionel. Anyway, that guy, the guy from the Financial Times, Lionel Barber of the Financial Times, mentioned in passing, it's a fleeting reference, that London is going to become the great center of the renminbi. And that's what we read here in this study, too. David Cameron, writes Chatham House, seems to have concluded that the risks of his cozy relationship with Beijing are outweighed by China's importance for London's financial primacy or primacy. President Xi Jinping was in London, right? So a key goal of the British courtship is to establish Beijing as the main offshore center outside of Asia for the trading of the renminbi. This as China's currency internationalizes. The Chinese will be building the nuclear plants for Britain. Isn't this horrendous? And British cybersecurity will be compromised by some of these projects that the Chinese are doing. And remember, there is that line from Fort Meade to the GCHQ, right, in Britain. And once the Chinese have their hands on the GCHQ over there, Cheltenham, they're gonna be controlling the umbilical cord of the special relationship between Fort Meade, Maryland, NSA, and MI5, MI6 in the GCHQ. So, and we can just tick off a few signs of this. It is a Chinese-British alliance. It is sinister, and it's coming after us now. Got to get ready to defend. World Crisis Radio. We are looking at the new role of the British, once the workshop of the world, now the counting house for Imperial China, the Middle Kingdom. And this is supposed to be the future for Britain. I think there are some people in Britain who don't like it. Here we have the Nobel Prize winner in economics, Robert Mundell, a famous drunk, as I know, from the Siena Group. Great powers have great currencies. Chatham House is exploring the internationalization of the renminbi at a conference in London last October and has prepared workshops on the subject. China is shifting from investment, capital goods, to consumption. And this is an important one. Last October, you remember there was this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, and the British led a whole bunch of smaller NATO states and other nominal U.S. allies. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, led that group of countries to say, we want to join the Chinese-dominated Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And all the mushheads said, oh, isn't that dandy? Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that conciliatory? Maybe not. Maybe you're dealing with an imperialist adversary, which is deciding to use all the tricks at their command to try to aggrandize their own power. This is not humanitarian. And I told you, Sapelli, as Sapelli said, you think U.S. world domination is bad, wait till you try Chinese world domination. However, the other side of this is China would like to have a reserve currency. There's no guarantee. As one of my Chatham House papers says, there is no guarantee that the renminbi will establish itself as a major world reserve currency and that London will corner the market on it. But for Britain right now, a middle-sized power in relative decline, thinking strategically how to play the fast-rising number 2 economy in the world, this courtship probably makes sense. So what do we have? Just a few things. September 2015, there's a joint statement that the British are China's best partner. October 21st, 2015, the British bet on the renminbi, says Chatham House. 28th of April, Britain is already the number 2 offshore renminbi clearing hub. 2015, and so forth, right? So you get the idea. The model, by the way, you want the historical model for the Chinese? It's Genoa. The idea you have this huge, monstrous empire. Well, how about the Spanish Empire in the 1500s? At that point, you'll remember, the hostility was between Spanish Empire and Venice, but the cordial cooperation was between the Genoese oligarchy, the hereditary enemies and counterparts of the Venetians. They were the bankers for Spain. They would take the silver off the Spanish treasure ships from Potosi and things like this, and then they would market that in the Far East, for example, where silver was in demand. The Bank of St. George, right, Banca di San Giorgio, was this key apparatus through which a lot of this stuff flowed. Now, of course, the Genoese did this because they had lost the War of Chioggia against the Venetians in 1380. There was also then a phase during the mid-1400s when the Genoese were back to that. So Genoa, in many ways, quite similar to the Venetians, less celebrated, less written about, but a fascinating case. And that may be the one that the British have in mind at this point. But now look, you want to have a reserve currency? Wonderful. I remember Medvedev had a little coin, and he brought out the coin, and he said, here, we can replace the dollar. Not so simple, Dmitry. In order to have a reserve currency, you've got to have a market for treasury bills, treasury notes, treasury paper that is broad and deep and liquid. And the U.S. has been working on this since before the Civil War in some ways, certainly since the Civil War. You've got to have a market that can take in 1 to 2 trillion every day and give back cash, into commercial bank accounts. And if there's some kind of a crisis, you've got to have a system that can handle 4 to 5 trillion of treasury bonds coming in and give you cash out of that. I don't see China having that. I'm not sure who has that. The U.S. has it. Japan may. They're closer to it, I think, than anybody else. But the British don't. And the British, and neither does the EU, as far as I can see. So the British don't have that, and they're trying to help the Chinese develop it. In other words, the basic summary is that Britain and China have now combined against the United States in an alliance of economic warfare. And that's the underlying fact of the Brexit. Brexit is needed, once again, so the City of London can totally escape the regulatory apparatus of the European Union, even though that had been watered down for them. They don't want any of it. And, of course, they go nuts over the Wall Street sales tax. The Wall Street sales tax would wipe them out. It would finish them. And in this case, the City of London sales tax of 1% or anything like that on financial turnover. So that's what's new. I don't see anything good about that. Call me old-fashioned. That looks pretty sinister to me. I don't want any part of it. So people have to think about, what do you want to live under, right? You want to be under Chinese labor laws? There's a communist country with, in many cases, no pension system, no government pension system, I'm pretty sure, and no minimum wage. And of course, that's just the way the British like it. So they're building their house on low wage to the extent that Americans are horrified by the chaos and destruction set loose by the Brexit. That will be one of the key nails in Trump's political coffin. In other words, Trump comes on the scene now saying, I am Brexit. Well, the answer to that is no thanks, because you're going to be seeing the horrors of Brexit, the unending chaos, the beginning of actual military threats that haven't been seen in 70 or 80 years. That's all going to be coming back. The other thing is, if the economy tanks, if we have economic crisis, I think much of the world will blame that on Brexit. Trump would like to blame it on Obama and Hillary. I don't think he's going to get very far with that. So he has tied himself to Brexit in a stupid way. Stupid. He didn't need to endorse that. Because now, if the world economy and the U.S. economy go into a panic spiral, then people can turn to Trump and say, you have no standing to complain. You, Trump, you scoundrel, you have been part of unleashing this chaos on the world. I would like to propose the coinage of a new term, the Vandals. Of course, it's not new, right? This was one of the more, what can we say, sociopathic peoples that came out of Central Asia, right, at the close of the Roman Empire. The Vandals, right? They're libertarian. They're anti-government. They worship wealth. They worship power. They're libertines, libertarians. They have no morality. They hate the major religious institutions, starting with the Vatican. The Vandals are at the gates. And the biggest vandal, of course, is Trump. So I urge people, the next 4 months, let your watchword be, stop Trump at all costs. We'll see you on World Crisis Radio. Happy 4th of July to all. To this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. And this is your host, broadcasting from Washington, D.C. It's July 1st, 2016. It's a day heavy in historical associations, excuse me, and anniversaries. It's July 1st. And of course, today we have the presence of a British nuclear submarine, the withered mummy of British imperialism is still attempting to lash out. A nuclear-powered submarine is now anchored below Gibraltar, the Rock. And of course, the Rock, it is no rock under modern conditions. Even 100 years ago, it was indefensible. The only thing that has kept Spain out of Gibraltar is a combination of, well, let's not be too harsh, but certainly of British dupery, going back to marriage policies of the British royal family back in the time of Edward VII. This is all discussed in Émile Flourens and his famous book, La France Conquise, France Conquered by Edward VII, 1907. He writes quite a bit about that. So look at that. A nuclear submarine, the first fruits of Brexit, the kinds of tensions among the large European states, these Central to Western European states, that had thought to have been banished after 1945, and now they're back because of the crackpot meddling of the British elite. And when we call them the British elite from now on, we've got to somehow call them the counting house of China, right? Used to be the workshop of the world. Now it's the counting house of China. We are in the presence of a cunning, treacherous, hostile, dastardly Anglo-Chinese alliance. Sino-British, Anglo-Chinese. I think the British will soon be gone, so maybe Anglo-Chinese or Sino-English, something like that. This is not humanitarian. This is not the wonders of the Spice Road or the Silk Road or anything like this. Those are more like the Spanish Road, if you know something about European strategy in the late 1500s and 1600s. The way that the Spanish Empire controlled the continent of Europe was by having this road which went everywhere, right? It's a system of roads. And that meant that there will be there, special air services, right? And the various equivalents thereof will be there. So let's take a look at the other side of this coin, right? It is the 100th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme, the first big day of actual attack by the British and French infantries that had been preceded by 8 days of bombardment, and the goal was to conquer high points like Thiepval in the countryside, and then use that as a jumping off point for a march on Berlin. And of course, that never happened. And instead you had a butcher's bill of hundreds of thousands of troops on the two sides. And by the way, it is this combination of Somme and Verdun in the same years essentially mean that Europe's world supremacy had ended, because it meant that these countries were then so weakened and so indebted as a result of their folly, their incalculable folly of 1916, we're talking 1916 now, Verdun and Somme, that by 1917 it was clear that nobody in Europe could end the war, and therefore the U.S. ended the war in service of the British and the French, and that was not a good thing. So we should remember all that stuff. Remember above all that the causes of the First World War are primarily to be sought in the diplomacy of Edward VII. Perfide Albion. Well, maybe we'll have a special chapter on Perfide Albion, because that is what we are seeing monstrously today. We've also got some really big anniversaries here in the U.S. Today is the anniversary of the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, when gallant commanders like John Buford of the cavalry of the Army of the Potomac stopped the Confederates outside of Gettysburg to the northwest and held there for some hours. A fight that then stretched all the way over to the Barlow Knoll. The 11th Corps of Howard was in there, and others. And John Reynolds of the 1st Corps, commanding on the battlefield, was killed as he was attempting to scout the best place to put the Union forces, and by suggesting Cemetery Hill, he, I think, proposed correctly, even though he paid with his life. And out on the Mississippi, July 1st, well, the cordons that the Spanish could deliver their troops where they wanted them. And when you talk about the Silk Road and the Spice Road today, these have now become, in effect, the tentacles of an imperialist power. And I join, once again, with the Italian economist Sapedli in pointing out to mushheads the world over, you who complain about U.S. world domination will be singing a different tune if you ever see Chinese world domination. You will like that a whole lot less. So all of the dumb, duped, gulled readers of Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky, all telling how benevolent a power China is. I'm afraid it's not. It could be, of course, but not under the morally challenged Chinese Communist Party, a very, very special bunch of people. And, of course, their anti-Americanism and their Oriental treachery, this is simply beyond challenge. So that's why we have this British nuclear submarine anchored there at Gibraltar, and parachute troops, paratroopers, special kinds of, essentially, SAS, I'm sure.